Welcome to the Kindness Is podcast, where we take a deep dive into the true meaning of kindness. I'm your host, Kaitlin Johnstone, the co-founder of Kind Cotton. Let's dive in. Hey y'all, so I want to start this episode of the Kindness Is pod with thanking all of you. Those of you who have left a review have given me so much motivation to continue, and I have read them with tears streaming down my face, and I don't think that I could ever thank you enough. So if you get anything out of this, please take a moment to review. It truly means the world. So, in other news, happy Pride. I am so excited for the incredible guests that we are going to have on the podcast this month. And we are kicking it off with a woman who is doing incredible work. She is going to take us down a road of activism and allyship and sharing some wonderful joy along the way. Because I think it's important to remember that we celebrate the LGBTQ plus community and that we don't solely pinpoint the attacks that are being taken right now on the LGBTQ plus community. Do we need to talk about that? Absolutely. Do we need to do our part to stand up against that? 100%. But we also need to celebrate. And we need to find ways to showcase LGBTQ plus joy. And that is exactly what this episode does. Okay, friends, I am so excited because today I have Rebecca Miner here with me. She is a queer Jewish clinician, consultant, and educator specializing in the intersection of trauma, gender, and sexuality. As a gender specialist, Rebecca partners with trans and gender nonconforming youth through their journey of becoming and helps parents in affirming that. Rebecca is a part-time faculty member at Boston University School of Social Work and always works through a lens that is trauma-informed and resilience-centered. In addition to all of her incredible clinical work, she also offers consulting for various organizations and schools. And I am just so honored, Rebecca, that you are here with me today. Is there anything else that you would like to add to this tremendous lengthy list of accomplishments?
Thank you so much. I don't think so. I think, it's always funny hearing your bio repeated back, right? I think one thing that probably isn't reflected is the amount of advocacy work that I'm doing these days. And that's something we can certainly talk more about to help people kind of figure out how to be active allies.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why, you are kicking off our Pride series. So I am just beyond thrilled that you are here, and our listeners are definitely gonna want to hear about that. I want to know first a little bit about you.
Sure.
And maybe why you were inspired to do the work that you were doing and just kind of your journey through showing up for yourself, in turn, ultimately showing up for others.
So the journey to this place started many, many years ago. And I think probably the fastest way to tell the story is that I had been a very active ally as a high schooler, unaware of my own queerness, until I got to college and had the opportunity to take a course called Queer and Pleasant Danger. And it was at that time that I read a memoir of Kate Bornstein, who's a trans woman. And I was able to really start to take a kind of different look at what had so often, at that point, it was 2007. So the way that trans folks had been represented in media was not often positive, and very limited in terms of what that possibilities could look like. And so it really brought a different perspective to it. And I was like, wait a minute, I really feel like everyone should be able to live in the fullness of who they are, whatever that looks like. And so that helped me focus what I already knew was going to be clinical work, but just a matter of figuring out kind of exactly who and who that work would be for. So it started there, and over the years, I, had various opportunities to continue kind of honing in on the intersection of gender, sexuality, and trauma. And so by the time I was able to practice independently, I started a private practice specifically focused on working with queer and trans youth, and they're supporting their parents in that process as well.
I want to start by saying thank you.
Thank you for thanking me.
Especially nowadays, and we're going to get into that. And I don't want to say nowadays in any way, shape, or form of glossing over what the trans community has had to go through all along, right? But I feel like right now, particularly, there is an intense attack on the LGBTQ plus community. I'm not saying that there has not been, historically speaking, either, but we are really in a time where it's not safe. And it is in your face all the time due to social media, news at our fingertips, what have you. So I want to start by saying thank you. I want to know, through your practice, if you have a story of love and hope that you want to share that kind of stands out to you, because I think we're hearing all the negative right now. And I want to also share some of the beauty. And I don't want this to just be attack, attack, attack and ugly. I want there to be some light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm hoping that you could share for maybe our trans listeners or parents of trans youth who may be hearing this, a beautiful moment.
Sure. So, it's always tricky with clients to figure out how to share people's stories in a way that honors that while also protecting their privacy.
Yes.
Which is such a challenge as a therapist, because I want to tell everyone about how amazing my clients are. And I'm so glad that you asked that, because so often I get asked to speak about, suicide rates and all of the very scary things that are happening and are very real, and mustn't be ignored, like you said. But at the same time, there's so much joy and so much possibility, and those stories don't often get told. So I think a recent story, I have a client who, and this is a great example of why gender affirming care is life-saving care, and can really, set people up for success in alignment with their peers developmentally too. So I have a client who I started working with when they were 12. And they are heading off to college. So I don't know why I was using they, he's heading off to college this coming year. And because he had affirming parents, and because they brought him to a therapist like me, who specialized in that and was able to help affirm and walk through that process with him, we were able to get him on blockers and start hormones all at the same time that his peers were developing as well. So he didn't have to go through the dysphoric experience of having a puberty that is not in alignment with who he was, and then having to kind of backtrack and deal with all of that. And instead, he never actually had to have a period. He never had to go through some of those secondary sex characteristics that can be so painful and so jarring for folks. And instead has had, I don't like to use this word, but a very normal or average kind of middle and high school experience. He has a girlfriend, he does after school activities. He has had what should be all trans youth's experiences of just a very having it be much like their other peers. It doesn't need to be a sad story. It doesn't need to be dramatic if we let people do what they need to do to be in alignment with who they are. So I feel so lucky because I'm with people in a lot of dark moments, but I also am exposed to all of these little pockets of joy of oh, this amazing thing happened at school, or I got cast in the musical as a gender that I never thought I'd be able to play. There are these little moments. And it's those stories that I think also help really connect people to trans folks and feel like a kinship. And that way, when they see things on the news, it doesn't feel like, oh, that's a terrible thing that's happening somewhere. It's like, oh, that's a terrible thing. And it's happening to someone that like I know and care about and can relate to and have empathy for. So yeah, I could go on and on and on.
I know. It's humanizing their experience.
Yes.
Right? It's putting the trans community in a light in which we are loving and valuing them for who they are.
Right.
And that's why, not to, derail and think of the work that we do, but that's why it is so crucial for all children to be reading inclusive books in their
From a
homes
very early age.
and in
Yes.
their schools,
Yes.
and so that children see, whether they are part of the trans community or not,
Mhm.
that everyone is different.
Mhm.
But within those differences, there is immense joy and beauty in which we should be celebrating and embracing these differences, not othering these differences.
Absolutely. And kids are fully equipped and ready for that. Like they're already doing it and they're ready for the conversations. It's often, unfortunately, I think that parents don't have the tools sometimes or are scared to embark on some of those conversations. And that's where books are such a wonderful resource because it's like, look, it's already right here. You just have to read it out loud or, help them depending on the age. But that's how generational change is going to happen, is if from a much younger age, we start to allow kids to see what's possible, and not in a way that's harmful or scary or inappropriate. But, so that people know, yeah, I can be this and that, or like I can have a family and be, like there are so many things that were limiting beliefs growing up, I think. And it's wild for me to see just the difference that's happened in my clients' age group from when I grew up, because it's not a huge gap. But it is a marked difference in terms of their comfort and like ability to claim who they are. They have language for it in a way that's like, it's incredible. And yeah, I hope we can do that for young kids too, because that's what's going to make a change.
100%. And you said something about age, and I just want to point this out to everyone listening. My daughter is 3.
Mhm.
She has a trans teacher who she loves immensely. And my daughter, can appropriately use her pronouns,
Mhm.
can understand, on a 3-year-old level, we read books that are very appropriate. I hate even throwing out the word appropriate because I feel like on the other side of things, we hear age appropriate all the time.
Mhm.
And it's just an attack, a
Right.
further attack on, oh no, we can't be doing this ever, right? We saw what happened with the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, initially starting as a K-3
Mhm.
legislation and it be deeming age appropriate. And now it's all the way through 12th grade, which we could see coming.
Right.
So I don't want to use that term, but I'm looking for the right term to describe that she is fully in understanding that her teacher is who she is.
Mhm.
You can see that, not just with the trans community, can see that there can be 2 mommies or there can be 2 daddies or there can be a mommy and a daddy, just like in her home.
Yep.
And all of these different identity dynamics and all of these different family structures. And all my daughter sees is love and understanding through us teaching her that.
Mhm. And you managed to do that with a family that doesn't look like some of those families that you just described, right? So it's about exposure.
Exactly. And not only exposure through books, but exposure through her life experiences. We're
Mhm.
choosing to live our lives. We had the privilege to move to a space that was much more inclusive.
Mhm.
We had the privilege to move to a space that is much more integrated. And we chose her school for a reason. We are choosing, at this age, the people who we fill our lives with. Not only is she experiencing this through books, but she's experiencing this in real life. So that's something that I always encourage parents that are cisgendered or are straight represent as so, or white, to really not only walk the walk through books, I mean, not only talk the talk through books, but walk the walk as well in their lives.
Yes.
So anyway, I got off on a tangent. I want to hear too, I think there's a lot of confusion. Now I may ask you some of those questions that you typically get asked, because I do think it's important.
Go for it.
What is gender affirming care? I know, but people may not.
I'm
There's
so
a lot
glad
of
you asked me.
misconceptions out there.
So gender affirming care can mean so many different things. And how it gets talked about a lot is, I think, in a very specific medical context when we're hearing about it in the news. So when we're hearing about, they're providing gender affirming care to 6-year-olds, first of all, that isn't true in the sense that they are trying to report it is, right? No one is performing major surgeries or administering hormones on small children. I just want to make that statement on any microphone anyone ever gives me, because it's essential for us to understand that so much of what we're hearing is misinformation. That being said, gender affirming care can be anything from a therapist or a teacher or somebody simply acknowledging and honoring someone's identity, giving space to explore, maybe changing a name or a pronoun or a haircut, things that we consider to be part of a social transition, perhaps, and all the way up through the medical aspects of adding hormones or potentially having surgery. All of which I think often gets conflated, because gender affirming care, I'm seeing a ton of memes and posts about how cis people get gender affirming care all the time. Like if you get Botox, that's gender affirming. If you, anything like that, like hair removal, all of that stuff that we don't think a moment about is gender affirming care. I personally was able to get a breast reduction when I was 17. Which looking back would have been an issue if it was gender related, right? They'd be like, oh, they're too young. But I had a back problem. And so insurance was happy to pay for it. And so that's what's wild to me, is the conversation about gender affirming care has gotten so twisted, because cis people are the folks getting the most gender affirming services and procedures and whatever all day long.
All the things.
So yeah, that's my roundabout answer to what is gender affirming care. But to me, it's about competent and informed care that supports the individuals being in the fullness of who they are.
I appreciate that, because as you said, I can't tell you how many times I have had to kind of fend off those comments and horrific things that I'm not even going to repeat on here. But I think it's important that we do put out actual factual information about what it is.
Yeah.
And what you do.
And we have a lot of rules around it. Like people talk about it like people are just doing these things all willy-nilly, but it's like, no, we have a very clear standards of care that have been outlined, and they're worldwide. Like anyone can read them. They're available online. But the way things get talked about is like, we're just out here handing out body parts to people.
Yes, so true.
Yeah.
And just
that was my censored version.
yeah, no, I know. To clarify on that and to piggyback on that, I want to say, don't children need to be persistent for an extended period of time to offer services? I mean, not to per se, like if your child wants to paint their fingernails, obviously they don't need to be saying for an increased amount of time, hey, I want to paint my fingernails, before you let them paint their fingernails. You should affirm whatever they want to do, because my husband even said to me the other night, he shared, oh my goodness, I can remember going to the nail salon with my mom as a very young boy and wanting his fingernails painted. And it wasn't something that was done. And not that my mother-in-law was like, no, you can't do that. I don't think he ever even voiced
Probably
that he wanted to do that, because it was so ingrained in him that little boys don't paint their fingernails.
Right.
So,
and those are the limitations that harm all of us, right? Like,
Mhm.
that's where it's like not
Mhm.
even a conversation about transness. That's just about like why we limit people in general of like all little kids should paint their nails if they want to paint their nails.
Exactly. 100%. So my question is to actually receive any potential hormone blockers or hormones, they have to be persistent about the fact that they are trans for a certain amount of time, correct?
Right. So you are thinking of something that is absolutely true, which is that there's been for a long time the idea that someone needed to be persistent and consistent in their reportings around that. Receive therapy, anyone can receive therapy. For things like that are medical interventions, there certainly does. I would not recommend that people go run out to their doctor as soon as their child expresses any kind of, gender expansiveness. Um, and providers will certainly say that to you. Like they're they're not going to just proceed with treatment because they have a kid who's showing up and saying this for the first time, which is why so often when parents reach out to me, even about therapy for a very young child, I tell them I don't think it's necessary. And that most
Mhm.
likely what's necessary is for the parents to do some parent coaching around
Mm.
unpacking their own ideas around gender and how they can show up and create opportunities for exploration for their little one, but not necessarily that kid needs therapy.
Mhm.
So it's a both and like, yes, yes, we do expect some persistence, and there is a reality to that not always being the case for some folks. Like some people are not persistent or consistent in their presentation, and that doesn't make it any less valid. But it is certainly something that we look for.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we should just all have therapy and it should be
Certainly.
more accessible.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering a little bit more about how you work specifically with caregivers.
Yeah. So I provide parent coaching for parents and caregivers. I'm right now I actually have a family that's doing two generations. So I have the grandparents and
Mm.
parents, and we all meet together, which is a really incredible opportunity to kind of unpack some old understandings of how gender's been in a family, and certainly, just create opportunities to have those conversations that we don't have often enough. And I think that's a big piece of the work that I do with caregivers is it's really an invitation to think about some of these things that so many folks just take for granted because we're socialized so strongly in the gender binary that it's just like,
Mhm.
here you go, you got handed this and you don't question it. And over a lifespan, you come up with all kinds of ideas about what that looks like. And oftentimes I find even for the parents who are feeling pretty resistant or, fearful around a potential transition, um, to give them the space to really explore, like, how do you know your gender? And
Mm.
do you like it? Like, are there things you like about presenting your gender in the way that you do? And often when people are really invited to that conversation, they're like, no, wait, this whole thing is a sham.
Yeah.
Or they do like aspects of it, or they relate to their gender in a way that's relational, right? So they're like, I know I'm a woman because I'm a mother, right? Like mothering feels central to my sense of womanhood. And yet one
Mm.
could make the argument that not all women are mothers and not all women can be. And
Mhm.
right, it's like, so it's loaded. So everyone's definition is going to be different, but a big part of that work is really, people always come in like, I want to talk about my kid because my kid is the thing we're here to talk about. But often the work starts with parents and caregivers having to kind of unpack their own relationship to some of these ideas and what it means to be a parent of a child who's a particular gender, right? Like so
Mm.
often it's deeply meaningful to people that they're a girl mom or a boy mom.
Mm.
And we see those hashtags and things like it's a viral phenomenon. And so it actually becomes almost like what feels like this like injury to their sense of self when their child is like, yeah, that's not me. Um, and it's a really interesting thing to process. But that's kind of the beginning of what that work looks like. And depending on the family and what's going on, you know, it can go in a variety of different directions depending on what people need. Did I answer your question?
You 100%
Okay,
answered my
great.
question. Yes,
Great.
no. I think that's important for people to hear too, because I don't think that people recognize that along this journey of supporting someone who is trans, they have to do a lot of self-reflection and their
Mhm.
own identity work in order for them to understand. So that's exactly what I was fishing
Good,
for there. So I
good, good, good.
appreciate it.
Yeah. And we see
Uh,
that get in the way with pronouns too, where people are
mm,
like, it's just too hard. And it's like, well, part of what's hard actually is you haven't made the cognitive shift to seeing this person as a different gender, right? Like you're still seeing whoever you thought was your son. And that's where you're getting tripped up in your brain because you haven't made that shift. And then once we do that and like go through what sometimes requires a grieving process,
mhm,
which I want to acknowledge is totally a thing that happens and is valid, and also something that should be dealt with, not with your child.
mhm,
It is not for them to hold your grief. Uh,
mm.
so that's that's what I'm here for.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because on a different level, that really resonates with me. I often share about how my dad was diagnosed bipolar when I was 16, and it wasn't until I was 32, so 5 years ago, that I decided, "Hey, I need to unpack this." And I went through, like, a lot of grief, and I
Mhm.
went through a lot of healing. It's a road that I am still on, because I essentially had to say goodbye to the father who I knew growing up.
Mhm.
I always joke that it would have been so much easier had my dad been, like, a deadbeat dad who wasn't present, and, like, I wasn't around much.
Right.
But I really did have to grieve that, and something that my therapist has always brought up to me is that this is my grieving process, right?
Mhm.
Like, this is
Mhm.
my story in this mental health journey and not my father's to carry, because he has his own
Yep.
burdens, right? So I think
Yeah.
that's something that is so key, and oftentimes we deflect onto the other person,
Oh
and we
yeah.
don't
And
only worry
parents,
about ourselves.
yes, and parents will say that to their kids, right? And I know it's coming from this like really tender spot of just
Mhm.
like, I need you to, be patient with me because I'm still like, and then they break into tears and are like, I miss my
Mhm.
baby. And the kid's standing there like, oh my God, I decided to be honest with my mom about who I am. And
Mhm.
this is what's happening. And both of those emotional experiences are like deserve space to be held.
Mhm.
But it's not the same space.
Yeah.
It's not certainly not the child's responsibility.
Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that.
Yeah. And I appreciate
Yeah.
your vulnerability also.
Mhm.
People don't always do that. So
Yeah. I
yeah.
think that's, like, a big part of why I'm having these conversations,
Mm,
and why I'm inviting people such as yourself on, and decided to even start this podcast, because over the years, we've really wanted to step away from just traditional small business, if that
mm,
makes any
mhm.
sense, and really dive into having these conversations and connections with people. And I think that that's a way that we can change what has traditionally always been done when it comes to kind of like a customer business perspective. It has to be this like global shift of coexisting with one another, and I can't do that, or I can't put out a new product or anything without there being this like true connection to it. So thank you for recognizing that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, um, that's something that sometimes comes up in when the standard questions I often, will get asked in these types of interviews. And it comes up sometimes around like my own choice to come out publicly.
Mm,
Uh, and like that was really inspired by my clients and the fact that I was like, if I'm going to be like the person who's like out here being like, come on out, it's great out here. I have to be out there too. And if my whole thing is like talking to people about living their truth and being in the fullness of who they are, then I need to walk that walk as well, as you said earlier.
I have a question about that. So
Yeah.
were you not out when you first started doing this work?
I was out personally, but not professionally.
Okay.
So it wasn't until I rebranded my website like 3 years ago now,
Wow.
that I was like, all right, I think we need to just do the damn thing. And to be honest, most of my concerns around it were about parents not trusting me. Because so often there's this narrative of like, you're just trying to turn our kids gay or turn our kids trans or whatever. And I was like, I in some ways, like parents thinking I'm this impartial party is helpful. And the reality is I am. Like, I have zero interest in helping anyone be something that they're not. And so, yeah, so it wasn't all that long ago that I was like, all right, I'm putting it on the Instagram bio. I'm putting it on my website. Like, that's how my in-laws found out. So yeah, so there's the other piece of context here that's important, which is that I'm married to a cis man. And so that was also a discussion of like, how can I move through the world and represent the fact that you can be queer and married to a cis person, right? Who does not share the same gender. And that's something that whenever I talk about it, I end up getting tons of messages, especially from women who are like, oh my God, I got married when I was so young and I just never thought about it. And now I'm realizing this about myself and I don't know what to do. And there again is this example of like, people aren't modeling enough possibility that like both of these things can be true. And it doesn't have to be an either or always.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I didn't know that side of you. Actually.
Right. And see, there's another example is I'm like, I should probably talk about this more.
Yeah.
And
I think
in part, I didn't do it when I started my Instagram because I was like, I'm going to lose my queer street cred.
No, I think
it's so silly. It's so silly.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people out there who fall into, I mean, I don't want to put you in a category, but there are a lot of people on Instagram who have talked about that journey. And I think that would help a lot of people. So I appreciate you sharing that piece of you. Oh my goodness. I am realizing, friends, that Rebecca and I have a very tight timeline today.
Yes.
And I cannot let this podcast go without mentioning what I did in the beginning about the attack, particularly on the trans community right now. Something that I've been doing in some other advocacy spaces to ban guns. Something that we are always saying is, listen, we are banning books. We are literally trying to ban human beings and take away their humanity. And we can't ban the number one killer of kids in this country right now. Like, what are we doing in our minds? So not to walk away from that too far, but I just want that to be a segue into what can people do? How can people actually show up? Because we can do the performative bullshit all day long of posting on social media, XYZ, as it is something that I do, but you also have to back that up with actual action. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what is something that allies, co-conspirators can take away from this podcast and go out and do today or continue to do?
Yeah, such an important question, because you're right. There is a lot of performative, action that can be made. Although I'm going to be honest with you, I'd love to see even more performative action. Like, I'm just not seeing enough, period, across the board. Like, and for months now, I've been like, okay, like, why are certain issues getting press and not others? Like, this is not common knowledge for everyone, which is baffling to me because I live in this like echo chamber of all of this stuff. But okay, focus, Rebecca. Quick answer. I made a page on my website because everyone kept asking me, what can I do? What can I do? So you can go to my website, which is genderspecialist.com. And there is a Protect Trans Youth page on there. It's also linked to my bio on Instagram, easy to find. And there I have curated things you can do, action steps you can take. Some of them are things to sign, some of them are calls to make, some of them are events or protests, ways you can show up, places to donate that are really like on the ground doing grassroots work. And then I all the time am sharing allyship tips and ways to take action in my newsletter and on Instagram. So those are great places to stay in touch with me too. I don't know when this podcast is coming out, but I assume it's after I have this event on Thursday. But it's probably after that. Yeah. Sorry, everyone.
No
But
worries.
keep your eye out because we'll probably do it again. So we're offering a workshop called Speak Up: Active Tools for Trans. Tools for Active Trans Allyship, to like these exact conversations. So stay tuned. If there's enough interest, we'll definitely do it again.
Yeah, that is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, because that was something that I missed as well. And now I need to check it out because I think that is incredible.
Thank you.
So you mentioned people can follow your website, follow you on Instagram. Can you just share your Instagram handle as well? Because I believe you shared the website, but I don't know that everyone knows where to follow you on socials.
Absolutely. So on Instagram, it's gender and then period and then specialist. Whoever has gender specialist, all one word, got it before me. But this is easier for neurodivergent brains to process, actually. So I think it's good. So you can find me there. And through either of those places, it's really easy to get access to any of my resources. I have a lot of free resources for parents and caregivers too. I have a course on how to talk to kids about gender, and some free PDF downloads too of lots of terminology. Sometimes that can be a barrier to talking about LGBTQ plus communities. So I've got an ever evolving glossary that I update. So you can download that, and a guide for what to do if someone comes out. So some free options for folks as well.
No, that's amazing. Thank you. And
Absolutely.
before we completely wrap up, as you know, this is the Kindnesses podcast, and I would love to know if you could redefine our traditional way of thinking about kindness and really focus it in a lens that is true to you and who you are. What would that be?
Oh, that's a really interesting framing. I'm curious about what the traditional definition of kindness is. But when I was kind of just sitting with what kindness is to me, I think it's about a generosity of whatever resources you have, whether that's time or energy or spirit or compassion, but it's all based in compassion and connection to other people. Like anything you can do to better a community, like our shared lived experience, and certainly like particular groups or anyone you know, on tiny scale, like teeny tiny, and macro scales. I think that's how kindness shows up, is through compassion.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, Rebecca. Thank you for
Absolutely.
doing all that you are doing. Thank you for being a safe space. Thank you for sharing joy. And thank you for being you.
Thank you so much. That's so kind. I appreciate it.
Bye, everyone. So, Rebecca is an absolute powerhouse who I wish I could have spent more time with. I hope that you took something away from this. I hope that you can use her free resources and you check out her website to see how you can make an impact. There are things that we can be doing to help support the LGBTQ plus community. There are things that we can implement in our everyday lives that will make an impact. So, as I always say at the end of these podcasts, I'm just grateful for this community. I'm grateful to be able to coexist in a space that values inclusion, that supports loving people for who they are, and that sees everyone and embraces their authenticity. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of the Kindness Is podcast. If you love it and it's adding even a little bit of value to your life, we would love, love, love if you could subscribe, rate, and review so we can reach even more people and make this world a little bit more kind.